All right, everyone. So I'm going to walk us through Babylon Revisited, which is a very famous short story by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And if you know his name, it's probably because you have read Great Gatsby. So The Great Gatsby is his most famous work. His most successful work was his first major novel, which was This Side of Paradise. And essentially, Fitzgerald writes about characters who are very similar to the lifestyle that he lived. So Gatsby's about a character who is in the jazz age, so in the roaring 20s, who is really taking advantage of the lifestyle. So drinking and partying and girls and all kinds of promiscuity that wasn't allowed before. This is post World War I. So we have, again, remember, we have this sort of narrative building of our identity here where things are starting to change. We're allowed to talk about things like in Hills Like White Elephants. We're allowed to talk about abortion. We're allowed to talk about sex outside of marriage. We're allowed to talk about affairs and all these different things that are sort of taking place. And what Fitzgerald does is he paints a very beautiful, vivid picture of this lifestyle, but he's also critiquing it at the same time because this lifestyle essentially costs him everything. So a lot of what happens in this story mirrors his own life and his own relationship with his wife Zelda, which very famously disintegrated in the 30s. So this one is written in 1930, and right at this time, we have a lot of things happening. So stock market just crashed a couple years before. In his personal life, Fitzgerald and Zelda had lived in Paris. They were part of the last generation. They're part of Gertrude Stein's salon. So they lived this lifestyle of always being out and partying and drinking and having the best time. And both of them had affairs, and they were very tumultuous in terms of their relationship with one another. Zelda suffered a lot of mental breakdown, essentially. She famously overdosed on pills when it was revealed he was flirting with and eventually had an affair with another woman. She herself flirted with other men directly in front of him, threw herself down the stairs at a party because she felt he was paying attention to someone else. So, and then ended up eventually in a sanatorium. So she ended up in a mental health facility. And no one knows if her overdose was a suicide attempt or not. It was very scandalous, very famous. And they too had a daughter. So a lot of what happens in here mirrors Fitzgerald's own sort of disintegrating marriage. And 31 is the year that he decided he had lost most of his commercial success, and he moved to Hollywood to try and make it as a screenwriter to make easy money because he never could match the success of his first two novels. Again, while he watched, his other counterparts like Hemingway continue to rise to fame and continue to build success and monetary success. So, Babylon Revisited is just this wonderful dip into an examination of post World War I and post Jazz Age Paris. We're heading towards World War II. And we really are having this nostalgia essentially, but also a critique for the sort of antics that went on while Fitzgerald was in Paris during this time in the 20s. So we start with this man named Charlie, and he's at a bar called the Ritz, a famous American bar. And he goes in and he realizes that he doesn't see he's come back to visit because he's been working in Prague. And he realizes he doesn't see a single person that he knows. And this is very discomforting to him because in his day, this was the era of the expats in Paris. This was the era of the Americans in Paris. And not just Americans, but it was a multicultural center where there was lots of life and partying, and everyone was always going at all times of day. There was always music and probably drugs and all kinds of things available. And he goes in and he realizes that, as he says, Paris is empty. So all of this wonderful memory, all these good things that he remembers are gone. And he goes into the bar and he sees this old friend, Alex. And they kind of reminisce a little bit about some old friends. And Alex kind of brings up, the fact that he's supposedly sober now. So Charlie, back in the day, was famously known for being kind of a drunk. And as the story unfolds, Fitzgerald reveals more and more why the drunkardness of the 20s and of his time there led to the dissolution of his marriage and him losing everything he valued. So they talk about these old friends, and they talk about how some of them are all bloated up, and he talks about these beautiful girls in the corner, and he says nothing affects them, he thought. stocks rise and fall, people loaf for work, but they go on forever. And the girls essentially are this representation of youth and vivacity in life that is Paris. So Paris doesn't change. They've changed and things have changed, but Paris itself is still there. It's just not the same as what he wanted, as what he used to want. And he's changed. So he reveals that he's here to see his daughter. So we know that his daughter, we kind of see that his daughter is staying with his brother-in-law and his wife. So essentially what we find out is that his wife, Charlie's wife, Helen, has died. And it's revealed slowly throughout the story that he was partially at fault in her death, essentially. And that's what his sister, blames him for, and why she doesn't want to relinquish control of his child. And so his daughter is named Honoria, and she is flourishing in Paris. She is in a safe, happy home with 2 stable parents. And she's really become this beautiful little girl. And he goes and visited her, and he's kind of in a morose mood. He has one drink. He tells them, he's trying to convince these people that he's not drunk anymore. He says, no, I only have one a day. I've already had it. I don't need a drink. So he's really trying to show his chops as a responsible adult. So he leaves in 678. He leaves and he goes and he sort of meanders around Paris and sees all of the different places that he used to visit. And he's kind of having this nostalgia wash over him. And so there's a lot of things that Fitzgerald name drops in here, or places that he alludes to, very famous places, famous bars and clubs and jazz clubs. And he talks about the different arrondissements. So we have Montmartre, we have all these different places. On 678, he mentions that he buys a ticket and goes to casino and watches Josephine Baker, who is a very famous African-American singer and dancer. And she became very, very famous in Paris. And Paris was, think about the time frame that we're talking about. We have the Harlem Renaissance taking place in America very, very soon, if not right then. But in Paris, there was a different understanding of race, and it was a much freer place for many African Americans, entertainers. Edith Piaf is one of the most famous singers, and is perhaps the most famous singer in all of Paris, and she was African American. It was just a place where a lot of African American artists could go and really find a niche and find fame. And it was a much more progressive place than America was at the time. So he goes all around Montmartre, and he kind of has these wonderful memories, but then he also brings about these bad memories of what led to him losing his daughter. And that was the loss of his wife, which, as we come to know, was sort of his fault. So on part 2, he wakes up and he says it was football weather, which is a particularly American phrase, which is a really key element. Fitzgerald constantly puts these very Americana phrases into and descriptions into his writing, whether that's colloquial language or really describing things that make it American. So football weather is something we still say today, coming with the fall. And so I just want you to kind of take note of how influential Fitzgerald's language really is. So he takes his little daughter out to lunch, and she innocently, he says, I want to go buy you anything you want from this toy store. And she says, well, I don't want anything from the toy store. And he says, why? And she says, because we're not rich anymore, are we? So this little girl is affected by the stock market crash, and everything has happened because she's grown up in this very stable home. So she doesn't have the sort of freedom of wealth that her parents obviously did, and the way that they wasted their wealth. So you get a sense that she's really become a different the generation that's upcoming post the Jazz Age is a much different generation. And so he says that he realizes he must be both parents to her here. And they go out, and as they're walking around, they see these 2 old friends, Lorraine and Duncan. Lorraine and Duncan are not married. They're just 2 friends, possibly lovers. And they both are semi-drunk, and they both invite him to come and have a drink, and he refuses. He says no thanks, and they say, well, we'll look you up. And he says, oh, I'll find you. I'm going to go to the show with my daughter, because he realizes that he's separated himself from that age. So Lorraine and Duncan are symbolic representations of the Jazz Age and the past era and all of his sort of sins in the past, and he wants to separate himself physically as much from that as possible. So he refuses their invitations. And much more, Lorraine herself is a sort of seductress. She's a physical temptation as well, because she's very open to these amorous encounters with him. It's very clear, and he refuses them. You see, he says it's on the bottom of 680, an unwelcome encounter, because they liked him because he was functioning. So he realizes they're jealous of him. He's functioning, he's serious, he's stronger than they are now. So he's moved on from this horrible time in his life, and he's become much more whole. And they want to draw a certain sustenance from his strength. So essentially they are like leeches trying to suck his strength and his stability away from him, and he knows he needs to protect himself and Honoria from that. He realizes on part 3, he reveals to his daughter, because she says, I want to come live with you. And he says this is what he's been gunning for the whole time, why he's been trying to show her her pseudo-parents why he's there. He wants his daughter back. He feels like he's sober, he's got his life together, he has enough money compared to other people, even compared to the ones who are raising her, and he wants his little girl back. So he has this conversation with Marion and the husband, and he basically says, I want her back, and she basically says no. And so we get this very strong female protective character. And the husband is much quieter, Lincoln. He's much quieter, and he's kind of willing to let her, he doesn't mind letting her go, because he loves the little girl, but she's another mouth to feed. He doesn't mind letting her go. But Marion is holding on to her because she's a reminder of Marion's sister, Helen, Charlie's wife, who died. And through this conversation, you see this back and forth dialogue that sort of builds and builds and builds in tension. And finally, she says, I'll never be able to forgive you for what you did. I'll never forgive you for locking her out. And we come to find out that they had an argument, and he ended up locking her out of, Charlie ended up locking her out of the house in the snow. And that's what made her catch pneumonia, and even though it seemed like she recovered, she eventually died. And so Marion blames Charlie for Helen's death. Now this is a similar situation to something that happened with Zelda while they were in Paris. Zelda had an amorous flirtation with an aviator, and Scott Fitzgerald got so jealous that he ended up locking her in the house until the aviator actually moved. You see the tumultuousness of their relationship was very strong. So we have this monetary discussion. We have the discussion of basically the crash and what it's done to the economy, what it's done to everyone, and how horrible it is. And this, he's lost most everything, but he's better off than most people. And she has this beautiful metaphor in 683 where he says, Marion had built all her fear of life into one wall and faced it towards him. So she had put all of her fear, all of her anger, all of her frustrations, all of the unfairness of life, and she was gunning for him. She's putting it towards him, and he could feel that wall, and he had to break down that wall somehow. It's a really beautiful metaphor, and this is just one of the many reasons why Fitzgerald's writing is incredible. So on 684, she has an outburst. She says, I can't help it. I can't help that I think that you're responsible for his death. This electric current of agony surges through him. So we see the guilt in Charlie. He is, and again, it's another beautiful metaphor right there, electric current of agony surging through him. He's tried to deal with the guilt, and he's tried to let it go, but it gets the best of him here. He goes home, and he's going to let her think over it. And she kind of gives up. She says, fine, do whatever you want. I can't, obviously I'm not in charge here. But as he's sitting at home, he's gone on this beautiful, Rue Bonaparte, so we've got this beautiful street, and all he can think about is Helen and what he's lost. And he thinks about sort of their mistakes, and they had all of this money, and they threw it all away, and they were frivolous with everything, and that's what he can't get over, is how frivolous their lifestyle was. It wasn't real. So it was sort of this gilded, again, along the lines of Twain, gilded age. It's a different age, but this here is a gilded age. So he's realizing that the things that they spent their money on and what they thought they enjoyed was not real. What they should have been enjoying was their life together, each other, and their daughter. So he says on 685, the present was the thing. Work to do and someone to love. That's what makes a person happy. So you can hear Fitzgerald's own voice in this saying, the life we lived is not real. It's not happiness. You can see everything sort of crumbling around him. He says, but not to love too much, for he knew the injury that a father can do to a daughter or a mother to a son by attaching to them too closely. So we get this incredible phrase of fear. Fear from the narrator and fear clearly from F. Scott Fitzgerald about losing people that you love, or them leaving you. So he says, while you and Helen were teetering around Europe throwing money away. That's how Lincoln describes it. He says, we were here. We didn't have much, but we were here. And so they have this discussion, him and Lincoln. He says, the big party is over now in 686. So the time of frivolity and of happiness and of carefree, everything has passed. And we are entering a new age in America, or American identity. So they get a note. He gets a note. He goes back to the Ritz, and he gets a note from Lorraine. And Lorraine basically says, I don't know why you were acting like that. I thought we had such fun, all these wonderful times. Why are you acting like this? And he kind of crumples up and realizes that, she's the temptation. Lorraine really is the temptation from the past, and he's done with the past. And he's sure about his future with his daughter. He's really worked hard to create a life for them. And so he goes back and he's talking with Marion and Lincoln, and who walks in but Lorraine and Duncan. They found him out, and so it's really a sense that you can't escape your past. It's a clear metaphor for the fact that you can't escape your past. It's going to follow you around. It's going to find you. And this is sort of this being haunted by your past is what Fitzgerald is really saying is problematic in the way that they live their lifestyle as expats. And so you have this lower class dialect sort of come in when Lorraine and Duncan are talking to them. And to come and die and sure your cousins won't mind, see you so solemn or solemn. And so we have this sort of lower class dialect, and he's realizing he's distanced himself from this as well. He's not a drunk. This isn't his world anymore. So he forces them to leave. And this changes everything. The fact that his past has come back to haunt him changes everything. Marion has a headache and she goes away, and basically he goes back to the bar and he calls up Lincoln, and Lincoln says, we need to table this for about 6 months because it just can't happen right now. And so you get the sense that you really can't escape your past. Everything is cyclical. And so he goes, in that sense, he goes back to the bar at the Ritz at the end. And so it literally is a book-ended story. We start at the bar, we end at the bar with Alex. And he and Alex are having a conversation. He decides to order a drink. So you see him giving it a little bit, and he has this temptation to just give in and go back to that lifestyle and be a drunk and just live in Paris and not care about anyone or anything. And he realizes he can't do that. Alex and him have a conversation. He says, Alex basically said, I lost everything. Everybody lost everything. You did okay. And he sees the moment where he's like, yeah, I am going to be okay. So this is a tiny little ray of hope. And basically, he realizes that he's going to have to work to try and get his daughter, but that it is something that he can't have right now. So he's going to have to continue to sort of pay for his sins by waiting to get his daughter and still getting his life together. And at the end, he says he was absolutely sure Helen would not have wanted him to be so alone. So the isolation one can feel even when surrounded by everyone else is a major theme in Fitzgerald's work, especially in Gatsby, who is the epitome of that theme. So this idea of isolation is really important as well. So hopefully you enjoyed Babylon Revisited. I have one more assignment for you to do, and then you can go ahead and move on.